The United States Department of Justice is facing mounting scrutiny over the way it handled the release of documents connected to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern history, the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. What was presented to the public as a step toward transparency has instead ignited suspicion, anger, and widespread distrust. The reason is simple. Of the hundreds of thousands of documents released, an overwhelming majority were heavily redacted. Entire pages were blacked out. Names vanished. Context disappeared. In some cases, more than 550 pages were rendered completely unreadable. And despite the massive scale of the release, only a fraction of the total archive has actually been made available to the public. For many observers, the document dump raised a troubling question almost immediately. If transparency was the goal, why was nearly everything concealed? But what truly set the internet ablaze was not the black ink. It was a photograph, a single image buried inside the Epstein files reignited one of the most controversial names in modern cultural history, Michael Jackson. The image appeared to show Michael Jackson standing alongside Bill Clinton and Diana Ross. Two faces in the photograph were blurred out in a way that suggested minors. The implications spread faster than any fact check ever could. Social media filled with reposts, reaction videos, and accusatory headlines. Within hours, Michael Jackson's name was once again entangled in one of the darkest criminal scandals of our time. And that is where the story takes a turn that many believe crosses an irreversible line, because, according to the Jackson family, that image was not just misleading. They claim it was deliberately misrepresented. Internet users quickly did what federal agencies apparently did, not or chose not to do. They traced the image back to its original source, the unedited photograph, which is publicly available through Getty Images, tells a completely different story. The blurred faces were not unidentified minors or alleged victims. They were Michael Jackson's own children. The photo was not taken at a private Epstein event. It was taken at a public fundraiser, one of many high-profile charity gatherings, where politicians, entertainers, and donors routinely crossed paths. In other words, the implication created by the redacted image was false, yet the damage had already been done for the Jackson family. This was not merely another rumor cycle or internet misunderstanding. This time, the source of the narrative was not tabloids, bloggers, or anonymous accounts. It was the federal government itself. Official documents released by the Department of Justice had placed Michael Jackson's name and image into the Epstein narrative without context, verification, or clarification. And according to Paris Jackson and Janet Jackson, that crossed a line that cannot be undone. Reports indicate that the Jackson family is preparing a lawsuit, seeking $100 million in damages against the Department of Justice. Not because they expect a financial settlement to restore Michael's reputation, but because they believe silence would guarantee that this pattern never stops. Michael Jackson's name has been dragged through headlines and courtrooms for decades, even after acquittals, even after investigations found no evidence. Even after his death, suspicion followed him like a shadow, not because guilt was proven, but because controversy was profitable and ambiguity was exploitable. But this time was different this time. The government released material that allegedly folded Michael Jackson into the Epstein scandal using imagery that his family says was doctored through omission and implication. The question that now dominates public discourse is chilling in its simplicity. Did anyone at the Department of Justice verify what they released before attaching Michael Jackson's name to one of the most toxic criminal cases in history? Or did they decide that the consequences did not matter because Michael Jackson is no longer alive to defend himself? The Epstein document release itself was enormous. More than 300,000 files were unsealed in a single wave. But almost immediately, analysts and journalists noticed something deeply concerning. Nearly 90% of the material was redacted. It's not lightly edited, not partially obscured. Entire narratives were erased. Pages of solid black ink replaced testimony, timelines, and names. The documents offered just enough information to provoke outrage, but not enough to establish accountability. And then came the image. The photograph showing Michael Jackson, Bill Clinton, and Diana Ross spread like wildfire. Two blurred faces positioned in a way that visually suggested minors. The framing did all the work. Before anyone asked where the photo came from or who those individuals were, the implication had already hardened into belief. What most people never saw was the full, unedited image. When viewed in its original form, the photograph shows Michael Jackson standing with Diana Ross and their children at a public event. Multiple angles from the same night exist. The setting was not Epstein's private residence. It was not a secret gathering. It was a high-profile fundraiser, attended by dozens of public figures. There was nothing controversial about the image until it was altered by selective rot. To be clear, Michael Jackson's name does appear in the Epstein files, but appearance does not equal accusation. There are no criminal allegations tied to him, no victims. No testimony accusing him of involvement in Epstein's trafficking operation. So, why was he mentioned at all? The answer lies in a brief period in the early 2000s when Michael Jackson was facing significant financial strain. At the time, he was exploring property acquisitions and seeking financial advice. One of the advisors he consulted also happened to work with Jeffrey Epstein. This led to a single business-related meeting at Epstein's Palm Beach residence in 2002. Michael Jackson's bodyguard at the time later confirmed the purpose of the visit. He also confirmed something else that rarely makes headlines. There were no minors present, and no inappropriate behavior occurred. But that context never accompanied the document release. And in the absence of context, speculation thrives. This is not a new phenomenon for Michael Jackson's legacy. For decades, his name has been treated as an open case file, one that the public feels entitled to reopen whenever a scandal demands a familiar face. From the late 1990s through the 2000s, Michael Jackson endured multiple legal battles that permanently stained his reputation, not because guilt was established, but because suspicion was louder than evidence, even prolonged federal investigations failed to substantiate the allegations against him. And yet, every time a massive scandal involving power, secrecy, and abuse surfaces, Michael Jackson's name resurfaces too. Why? Because he is controversial, because he is dead, and because attaching his name to a narrative carries minimal resistance. That is why this Epstein image hit differently. For Paris Jackson and Janet Jackson, this was not just another cycle of misinformation. It was the same pattern repeating, except this time the source was institutional. And they decided they were done allowing Michael's name to be used as the path of least resistance. Because if they did not draw a line here, there was no reason to believe it would ever stop. As the images circulated, the Jackson family did not remain silent. Behind the scenes, they challenged the way the documents were presented. Names and visuals released without explanation. Cropped imagery creating false narratives. Selective redactions that caused more harm than clarity. Taj Jackson publicly thanked fans who moved quickly to shut down the misinformation, but he also called out the larger pattern. He described Michael as a constant distraction, a scapegoat, used to divert attention away from others, and this time, family went further. According to reports Paris Jackson and Janet Jackson made, the decision that silence was no longer acceptable. Not after watching a federal document release reinsert Michael Jackson's image into one of the most horrific scandals in recent history without justification. The reported lawsuit is not about money. It is about accountability. It is about asserting that even the government does not get to damage a man's legacy without evidence, especially when that man cannot defend himself. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media erupted with anger, frustration, and recognition of a familiar playbook. Comment after comment pointed out that nearly every viral post had been community noted to clarify Michael Jackson's innocence. Others spoke about how visibly uncomfortable he appeared in the few images where Epstein was present. Some fans went further, demanding action instead of statements. They argued that tweets and explanations were not enough when the federal government itself released misleading material to the world. And by then, the pressure shifted. Because when you zoom out, Michael Jackson's presence in the Epstein files does not expose power, it protects it. More than 90% of the documents remain redacted. Names erased, context destroyed. And yet this was labeled transparency. One unredacted file reportedly includes testimony accusing Donald Trump of sexual assault. Others question whether Epstein's death was truly a suicide or whether it was orchestrated to protect powerful figures. But those threads remain unexplored. Instead, the faces made visible are the ones already burned. Prince Andrew, Bill Clinton. Figures whose reputations are either already damaged or whose association carries minimal legal risk. And that brings us back to the core issue. Michael Jackson was not part of Epstein's criminal operation, but he was controversial enough to draw attention away from those who still cannot be named. The real story is not who appeared in the files, it is who did not, who the black ink continues to protect, and now. This lawsuit represents something larger than Michael Jackson alone. It challenges how half-disclosed documents can manufacture full-blown narratives, and how a dead man can absorb the fallout while those with power remain shielded. Paris and Janet Jackson are saying that stops here. Michael Jackson will not be used as cover anymore, and the most unsettling truth is this: these files were never meant to tell the whole story. They were meant to tell just enough to keep people angry while the real names stayed buried. And until that changes, this story is far from over.